They thought they were removing a nobody from first class that morning, but they were seconds away from grounding careers that had taken decades to build. The cabin lights glowed softly against polished wood panels and brushed gold trim as Flight 247 prepared to depart from Los Angeles to New York, champagne glasses clinking gently, while tailored suits and silk scarves filled the wide leather seats of the first-class cabin. Emily Carter sat quietly in seat 2A, her light gray cardigan folded neatly over her shoulders, a worn paperback resting in her lap, her posture calm, almost invisible against the hum of quiet privilege surrounding her. She had arrived early, boarding without rush, offering a polite smile to the flight attendant who scanned her boarding pass without truly looking at her. At 34, Emily carried herself with a quiet steadiness that came from knowing exactly who she was, even if no one else bothered to ask. Across the aisle, a man in an expensive navy suit adjusted his platinum watch and glanced at her shoes, simple flats, practical and understated, before returning to his phone. The subtle choreography of status was already unfolding. A moment later, Linda Whitmore, the senior flight attendant with 20 years of immaculate service pinned to her lapel, paused mid-step when her eyes settled on Emily. Linda's gaze traveled slowly, cardigan, denim slacks, canvas tote, then down to the boarding pass in Emily's hand. Her professional smile remained fixed, but something behind it hardened. "Ma'am," she said in a tone sweetened by precision, "may I see your ticket again?" Emily looked up gently, her blue eyes steady, and handed it over without hesitation. Linda examined it longer than necessary. Around them, conversation softened. A businessman leaned slightly into the aisle. Another passenger adjusted her sunglasses just enough to watch. The air shifted almost imperceptibly. "There seems to be some confusion," Linda continued, her voice carrying just enough volume to travel beyond row 2. First-class passengers typically board through priority verification. "Are you certain you're seated correctly?" Emily glanced at the seat number printed clearly on the pass. 2A. She nodded once. "Yes, I am." A faint whisper rippled behind them. Someone chuckled under their breath. Linda's smile thinned. "Sometimes tickets get reassigned at the gate. It happens." She gestured lightly toward the curtain separating cabins. "I can escort you to your proper section." Proper. The word lingered longer than it should have. Emily felt the weight of a dozen eyes without turning her head. She simply folded her book, closed, and rested it calmly on her lap. "I purchased this seat 3 weeks ago," she said softly. No irritation. No embarrassment. Just fact. Linda inhaled slowly, the practiced patience of someone accustomed to control. "I'll need to verify this with the gate supervisor." She stepped away, heels clicking against the polished floor, leaving behind a silence that thickened by the second. Across the cabin, a murmur built like distant static. A woman 2 rows back leaned forward and whispered, "This is why they need stricter boarding checks." The comment was not loud, but it was deliberate. Emily kept her gaze forward, hands resting lightly over her boarding pass, as if she had all the time in the world. And in that stillness, as sunlight streamed through the oval window beside her, no one in that cabin realized they were watching the first quiet crack in their own carefully constructed hierarchy. When Linda Whitmore returned, her expression had shifted from polite doubt to procedural authority, the kind that carried the weight of company policy behind every syllable. 2 junior attendants followed a few steps behind her, their posture stiff, their eyes carefully neutral. The cabin had grown quieter, not out of courtesy but anticipation. Linda stopped beside seat 2A and held the boarding pass between 2 fingers as if it were fragile evidence. "Ms. Carter," she began, her tone now cool and formal, "there appears to be an irregularity connected to this ticket purchase. Until we can resolve the matter, I will need you to step out of first class." The word irregularity drifted through the air like smoke. Emily looked up slowly, not startled, not offended, simply attentive. "What kind of irregularity?" she asked. Linda did not answer directly. "The system does not reflect your passenger profile as a typical first-class traveler." A man across the aisle raised his eyebrows. Someone near the window shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Emily felt the heat of scrutiny along her shoulders, yet kept her voice even. "My profile." Linda's jaw tightened just slightly. "Our premium cabin requires additional verification when discrepancies arise." The implication hung heavy, and unmistakable. Emily placed her book inside her canvas tote with deliberate calm. I purchased this seat under my legal name with a confirmed payment. If there is a mistake, I am happy to wait while you verify it. Her composure seemed to irritate more than reassure. Linda straightened. We cannot delay departure for individual concerns. Please gather your belongings. The word please carried no invitation. A soft murmur rippled again through the cabin, this time edged with discomfort. One passenger avoided eye contact entirely. Another leaned back as if distancing himself from the scene. Emily rose without argument, smoothing her cardigan as she stepped into the aisle. The movement felt symbolic, a quiet surrender that was not surrender at all. She could feel the invisible line being drawn between belonging and exclusion, between appearance and assumption. As she stood, Linda gestured toward the curtain dividing cabins. We will relocate you temporarily. Temporarily. The term was almost kind. Emily paused just long enough to meet Linda's eyes. There was no anger there, only a steady clarity that unsettled more than outrage ever could. I would prefer this be resolved before we depart, she said gently. Linda hesitated, then glanced toward the cockpit as if seeking reinforcement from an unseen authority. The boarding door remained open. The engines had not yet started their low mechanical hum. Time still existed to correct what was unfolding. Yet pride moved faster than policy. Ma'am, Linda replied, her voice firming. If you do not comply, we will have to escalate this matter. The word escalate carried a warning without violence, a suggestion of consequence rather than compassion. Around them, first class watched in suspended silence. Crystal glasses trembled slightly with the faint vibration of ground equipment outside. Sunlight continued to stream through the oval windows, illuminating polished leather seats that suddenly felt less luxurious and more like a stage. And as Emily stepped forward into the aisle, boarding pass still in her hand, no one in that cabin understood that the real discrepancy was not in the system, but in their judgment. Emily had taken no more than 3 measured steps into the aisle when the shift in the cabin became palpable, as if everyone sensed that something larger than a seating dispute was unfolding. Linda Whitmore lifted her chin slightly, mistaking Emily's calm compliance for quiet defeat. This way, please, she said, gesturing toward the narrow passage that led out of first class and into the jet bridge. The words sounded procedural, but there was a faint edge of triumph beneath them. Emily moved forward without protest, her canvas tote resting lightly against her shoulder, her boarding pass still between her fingers. The businessman across the aisle cleared his throat but did not speak. The woman in oversized sunglasses looked down at her phone, suddenly fascinated by her screen. Silence, after all, is often easier than courage. As Emily reached the curtains separating cabins, Linda stepped slightly ahead of her, as though shielding the premium passengers from further inconvenience. We will reassign you once this is clarified, Linda stated, her voice loud enough to reassure the onlookers that order was being restored. Emily paused just before crossing the threshold and glanced back at seat 2A, sunlight still warming the untouched leather cushion. I do not require reassignment, she said gently. I require verification. The distinction lingered in the air. Linda exhaled sharply. Ma'am, the verification process can take time. We cannot hold the aircraft. The engines outside began their low, distant rumble, ground crew signaling final preparations. A subtle tension threaded through the cabin as passengers checked their watches, eager for departure. Delays, even small ones, were an unforgivable inconvenience in this altitude of expectation. Emily stepped fully into the jet bridge, where the cool conditioned air replaced the warm glow of the cabin. The space felt narrower, quieter, less performative. Linda followed, lowering her voice now that the audience had diminished. You should understand that first-class travelers are part of a curated environment, she said, as though explaining a social rule rather than an airline policy. Discrepancies create discomfort. Emily met her gaze evenly. Discomfort for whom? Linda did not answer. Instead, she motioned toward the gate podium where a supervisor typed rapidly, eyes flicking between screens. The boarding door remained open behind them, a visible pause in departure. Emily reached into her tote and retrieved her phone. Her fingers hovered for a second before selecting a familiar contact. The call connected quickly. Daniel, she said softly, her tone steady. There seems to be a situation with my seat. There was no panic in her voice, no plea, only information delivered with quiet precision. On the other end of the line, a brief silence followed, then a measured reply. Stay where you are. Emily ended the call and slipped the phone back into her bag. Linda folded her arms, unaware that the pause she considered an inconvenience was about to become a reckoning. Behind them, the murmur from the cabin had grown restless. A gate agent whispered to the supervisor. The supervisor's expression shifted, then stiffened. Footsteps approached from the terminal corridor, deliberate and unhurried. And in that suspended moment between departure and discovery, no one present realized that the real irregularity was not a ticket mismatch, but a miscalculation of exactly who they had just asked to leave. The footsteps that echoed down the terminal corridor were not hurried, yet they carried a gravity that shifted the atmosphere before the figure even came into view. The gate's supervisor straightened abruptly, smoothing his jacket as though preparing for inspection. Linda Whitmore remained unaware, her attention fixed on Emily with controlled impatience. This will only take a moment, Linda said, though her tone betrayed irritation at the delay. Behind the podium, the computer screen refreshed again, and the supervisor's expression drained of color. He glanced toward the approaching figure, then back at the monitor, as if hoping the data would change. It did not. Daniel Carter stepped into the jet bridge entrance with the composed authority of someone accustomed to rooms adjusting when he entered them. His navy suit was tailored but understated, his expression calm, his eyes scanning the scene with quiet calculation. He did not raise his voice. He did not rush. He simply walked forward, each step measured. A hush fell not only in the jet bridge, but inside the first-class cabin beyond, where passengers had begun to notice the shift in posture among the staff. One attendant instinctively straightened her scarf. The gate's supervisor moved quickly toward Daniel, offering a strained smile. Mr. Carter, we did not expect you on this flight. Daniel's gaze moved past him and settled on Emily standing beside her tote bag, composed as ever. Neither did I, he replied evenly. Linda blinked, confusion flickering across her face. She had not yet connected the name with the man before her. Sir, this is a restricted boarding area. She began cautiously, still attempting to maintain procedural control. The supervisor swallowed. Ms. Whitmore, he said quietly, this is Daniel Carter. The name landed heavier than any announcement over the public address system. Linda's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Daniel stepped closer, stopping just beside Emily, not in front of her, not shielding her, but standing as an equal presence. I understand. There is an issue with my wife's seat, he said calmly. The words were neither accusatory nor dramatic, yet they carried an unmistakable clarity. Inside the cabin, several passengers exchanged startled glances. The businessman who had earlier observed now leaned forward, recognition dawning across his face. The airline's name was stitched subtly along Daniel's cuff, an insignia that suddenly felt less decorative and more definitive. Linda's composure faltered. Your wife? She repeated, her voice thinner now. Emily met Daniel's eyes briefly, a silent reassurance passing between them. Daniel turned his attention back to the supervisor. I would like to understand why a confirmed first-class ticket purchased 3 weeks ago was deemed irregular. There was no anger in his tone, only expectation. The supervisor glanced nervously at Linda, who felt the weight of a realization settling over her. The engines outside had begun their low, continuous hum, but inside the jet bridge, everything seemed suspended. First-class passengers peered discreetly through the curtain. The hierarchy they had relied upon only minutes earlier was unraveling in real time. Linda inhaled, attempting to regain control of the narrative. There appeared to be a discrepancy in passenger profile, she explained, though the phrase now sounded hollow. Daniel's expression did not change. Profile, he repeated softly. The word echoed with quiet consequence. And in that narrowing space between authority assumed and authority revealed, the true measure of status was no longer written on a boarding pass, but exposed in the silence that followed. The silence that followed Daniel Carter's single repeated word settled heavier than any raised voice ever could. Linda Whitmore felt the subtle shift in gravity, the way the gate's supervisor's posture straightened not out of courtesy, but accountability. Daniel did not look angry. He looked precise. Explain the discrepancy, he said calmly. directing the request toward the supervisor rather than Linda. The supervisor cleared his throat, glancing at the screen that had moments ago confirmed everything. There is no discrepancy, sir. The ticket was valid. It was purchased under a verified executive account. The word executive hung in the air like a quiet verdict. Inside the first-class cabin, passengers leaned closer, no longer pretending disinterest. The businessman who had earlier judged with a glance now avoided eye contact entirely. Linda felt heat rise along her collar as realization sharpened. She had not questioned a boarding pass. She had questioned belonging. Daniel's eyes moved briefly toward the open cabin door, where the leather seats waited untouched. My wife selected that seat intentionally, he said evenly. She prefers the window. There was something deliberate in the simplicity of that statement. Not wealth. Not status. Preference. A choice. Emily stood beside him, neither triumphant nor wounded, simply steady. She had not needed rescue. She had needed recognition. Linda straightened, attempting to gather what remained of her authority. Sir, our premium cabin standards require consistency among our clientele. The phrase sounded rehearsed, safe behind policy. Daniel regarded her for a long moment. Consistency, he repeated softly. Does that include assumptions about appearance? The question did not accuse. It revealed. The gate's supervisor lowered his gaze. The engines outside continued their steady hum, but departure had clearly paused. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, aware now that they were witnessing something more than an airline correction. Daniel stepped slightly closer to Linda, though his tone remained measured. This airline was built on service, not social sorting. Every first-class passenger is verified by purchase, not wardrobe. The words carried neither hostility nor drama, only clarity. Linda's confidence faltered completely. I was ensuring the comfort of our guests, she replied, though the defense felt thinner with every syllable. Daniel nodded once. Comfort should never require exclusion. The supervisor quickly interjected. Ms. Carter's seat will be reinstated immediately. He gestured toward the aircraft, eager to repair what could still be salvaged. Emily looked toward the cabin entrance, then back at Linda. There was no satisfaction in her expression, only quiet resolve. I would like to board, she said gently. The simplicity of her request cut deeper than any reprimand. As she stepped forward, passengers inside straightened in their seats. The atmosphere transformed from superiority to scrutiny. Linda moved aside, her earlier certainty replaced by careful deference. The curtain parted once more, revealing the polished leather of seat 2A, still warmed by sunlight. And as Emily reclaimed her place without spectacle, the lesson unfolding in that cabin was not about power revealed, but about dignity restored in the stillness that followed. Emily settled back into seat 2A with the same unhurried grace she had carried from the jet bridge, placing her canvas tote beneath the seat in front of her and smoothing the gray cardigan at her shoulders as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. The sunlight through the oval window framed her profile in quiet gold, and for a moment, the first-class cabin felt smaller, more exposed. Conversations that had once carried easy confidence now stumbled into awkward fragments. A flight attendant approached with a glass of sparkling water, hands noticeably steadier than her voice. Welcome back, Miss Carter, she said carefully. Emily offered a polite nod. Thank you. No triumph. No trace of resentment. Just composure. Across the aisle, the businessman who had earlier studied her shoes now focused intently on the in-flight magazine, though he did not turn a single page. Daniel remained standing briefly near the entrance to the cabin, speaking in low tones with the supervisor and the captain who had emerged from the cockpit after being alerted. The captain's posture was formal, respectful. Mr. Carter, this should not have happened, he said. Daniel's response was measured. Then it should not happen again. There was no threat in his voice, only expectation. The supervisor nodded quickly, already aware that internal reports would follow, that policy language would be reviewed, that words like profile and consistency would not survive the afternoon. Daniel finally stepped toward Emily's seat. He did not make a spectacle of his presence. He simply rested his hand lightly against the headrest beside her. Are you all right? He asked quietly. Emily looked up at him, her expression steady. I am fine, she replied. I would like to depart on time. A faint smile touched Daniel's face, not amused, but proud. He turned toward the captain. Let us not delay the passengers any further. The engines outside deepened in tone as the boarding door finally closed. Linda Whitmore stood several rows back now, her posture restrained, the authority she had worn so confidently replaced by reflection. She approached cautiously, stopping a respectful distance from seat 2A. "Ms. Carter," she began, her voice noticeably softer than before, "I owe you an apology." The cabin grew quiet once more. Emily turned her head slightly. "For the inconvenience?" she asked gently. Linda hesitated. "For the assumption." The words settled heavily between them. Emily studied her for a brief moment, then nodded once. "Assumptions can be corrected," she said. "That is the fortunate part." There was no lecture, no demand for consequence. Only truth delivered without cruelty. As the aircraft began its slow taxi toward the runway, sunlight shifted across the polished cabin walls, illuminating faces that now looked different than they had 30 minutes earlier. The hierarchy that once felt unquestioned had quietly dissolved, replaced by something less comfortable but more honest. Daniel took his seat beside Emily only after ensuring operations resumed smoothly. Outside, the runway stretched ahead in a long silver line beneath the California sky. Inside, the lesson lingered without announcement. True class is not assigned by seat number, and dignity does not require display. And as the plane lifted gently into the air, carrying its passengers eastward, what remained grounded behind them was not just a mistake in judgment, but the illusion that status can be measured by appearance alone. At 35,000 feet above the desert, the cabin settled into the familiar rhythm of cruising altitude, a steady hum beneath polished calm. Yet something intangible had shifted among the passengers of first class. The early confidence that once floated between seats like invisible currency had been replaced with quiet introspection. Emily rested her head lightly against the window, watching clouds stretch endlessly beneath them, her reflection faint against the bright sky. She did not replay the moment on the jet bridge. She did not rehearse what she might have said differently. She simply breathed, steady and unshaken. Beside her, Daniel reviewed a brief message on his phone before turning it face down on the tray table, signaling that the matter was no longer urgent, but remembered. Across the aisle, the businessman finally closed his magazine, clearing his throat as though seeking permission to speak. "Ma'am," he began cautiously, leaning slightly toward Emily. "I believe I owe you an apology as well." His voice carried the stiffness of someone used to admitting fault. Emily shifted her gaze toward him, her expression neither guarded nor triumphant. "For what?" she asked gently. He hesitated, searching for the right language. "For assuming." The word seemed to cost him more than he expected. A faint nod was all she offered in return. "We all make assumptions," she replied. "The important part is recognizing them." The conversation ended there, not because there was nothing more to say, but because the lesson had already taken root. A few rows back, Linda Whitmore stood near the galley reviewing service notes, her reflection staring back at her from the stainless steel surface. She had built a career on precision, on maintaining an environment she believed required control and discernment. Yet control, without understanding, had revealed its flaw. She approached the cockpit once more, requesting a moment with the captain. "I would like to file a voluntary review of the incident," she said quietly. The captain regarded her for a moment before nodding. "That would be appropriate." Linda returned to the cabin with slower steps, the weight of experience reshaping something internal that policy alone never could. Daniel leaned slightly toward Emily. "There will be internal changes," he said softly, "but not out of anger." Emily looked at him, sunlight catching the small wedding band on her hand. "Make them out of clarity," she replied. Daniel gave a subtle nod. He had built an airline on principles of service, efficiency, and excellence. But even systems designed with care could inherit blind spots. The cabin crew resumed beverage service with renewed attentiveness, though now it felt less about display and more about genuine hospitality. Outside, the horizon curved gently beneath the wing. Inside, conversations were quieter, more deliberate. The illusion that luxury alone defined worth had quietly dissolved somewhere over Nevada. Emily reopened her paperback, turning the page with calm focus. There was no need for celebration, no need for reprimand. The moment had already spoken for itself. And as the aircraft continued eastward through open sky, what lingered among those leather seats was not embarrassment, but awareness, the understanding that dignity is not granted by altitude, and respect is not reserved for those who appear to deserve it. As the aircraft crossed into the darkening sky above the Midwest, cabin lights dimmed to a softer glow, casting long reflections across polished surfaces and quiet faces. Dinner service had ended, trays cleared, conversations lowered to murmurs that blended with the steady white noise of cruising altitude. Emily closed her book and rested it on the fold-down table, watching the faint outline of city lights far below. The earlier tension had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something more reflective, less defensive. Daniel leaned back in his seat, studying the cabin without appearing to do so. He noticed the subtle change in the way attendants moved, the extra pause before addressing passengers, the measured courtesy that felt less rehearsed and more conscious. Near the galley, Linda Whitmore stood reviewing the service checklist, though her thoughts were clearly elsewhere. After a long moment, she approached. Seat 2A once more, not with authority this time, but with humility that carried its own quiet strength. "Ms. Carter," she began, her voice steady but subdued. "I have served on this airline for 2 decades. I believed I understood excellence. Today reminded me that excellence without empathy is incomplete." Several passengers within earshot pretended not to listen, yet every word landed. Emily turned toward her, expression composed. "Growth does not require humiliation," she said gently. "It only requires honesty." Linda nodded once, absorbing the distinction. "There will be changes," she replied softly. Daniel looked up at that. "Policies matter," he said evenly, "but culture matters more. This airline will review both." His tone carried no anger, only clarity, and the certainty that words spoken at altitude would translate into action on the ground. The businessman across the aisle shifted again, this time offering a faint nod toward Emily, as though acknowledging a lesson learned without needing further dialogue. Beyond the window, clouds parted briefly to reveal a crescent moon suspended in the night sky. The aircraft continued forward with quiet strength, engine steady, destination fixed. Inside the cabin, the earlier hierarchy had dissolved into something less rigid and more aware. A younger flight attendant approached with warm tea, hands no longer tense. "Complimentary," she said simply. Emily accepted with a grateful smile. "Thank you." There was no grand announcement, no public correction broadcast over the intercom, yet the atmosphere itself carried the change. Respect had shifted from assumption to intention. Daniel reached for Emily's hand briefly, not in display, but in shared understanding. The incident would become a formal report, a meeting, perhaps even a revised training protocol. But in that quiet cabin at 35,000 feet, the deeper transformation had already begun. Luxury still surrounded them in polished trim and spacious seats, yet it no longer defined the room. What defined it now was awareness, the subtle understanding that dignity is not verified by profile, and class is not curated by clothing. And as the aircraft traced its path eastward through open sky, what endured within those leather seats was not embarrassment, nor victory, but a recognition that respect, once restored, travels farther than any flight ever could. By the time the aircraft began its gradual descent toward New York, the cabin had returned to its polished stillness, yet nothing inside it was quite the same. City. Lights shimmered below like scattered constellations, reflected faintly across the oval windows and the quiet faces of those who had witnessed the morning's unraveling. The captain's voice came gently over the intercom, announcing clear skies and an on-time arrival, as though the flight had been ordinary from beginning to end. But for those seated in first class, something intangible had shifted at 35,000 feet and would not be left behind on the runway. Emily folded her cardigan neatly and placed her paperback back inside her canvas tote, preparing to land with the same quiet composure she had carried through the entire journey. There was no sense of victory in her expression, no trace of lingering resentment. Only calm. Daniel glanced once more through the cabin, observing subtle gestures that would have gone unnoticed hours earlier. Passengers who had once measured one another with silent judgment now offered small nods, faint smiles, an acknowledgement of shared humanity rather than silent hierarchy. As the landing gear extended and the city grew clearer beneath them, Linda Whitmore stood near the front galley, posture straighter than before, not with pride, but with purpose. She had already drafted a report in her mind, outlining changes in training language, revisions in customer profiling procedures, and conversations that would follow in conference rooms far from this cabin. Excellence would remain the airline standard, but it would no longer be confused with exclusivity. The aircraft touched down smoothly, wheels meeting pavement with controlled grace. Applause did not follow, but there was a quiet exhale that moved collectively through the cabin. When the seatbelt sign dimmed, passengers rose more slowly than usual, retrieving carry-ons without the familiar rush of entitlement. Daniel stood and stepped into the aisle, allowing others to exit before him. Emily followed, her movements unhurried. As they approached the front door, Linda met her eyes one final time. "Thank you for your patience," she said sincerely. Emily offered a small nod. "Thank you for your reflection." The words were simple, yet they carried more weight than any reprimand could have. Daniel paused briefly beside the captain before stepping onto the jet bridge. "Let the lesson travel further than this flight," he said quietly. The captain inclined his head in agreement. Inside the cabin, leather seats remained perfectly arranged, champagne glasses cleared, surfaces polished as though nothing had disturbed their symmetry. Yet, something invisible had been reordered. What once seemed like a curated space defined by image had become a reminder that dignity does not ask for permission to belong. As Emily and Daniel disappeared into the terminal crowd, indistinguishable from any other travelers, the true measure of class lingered behind them in the stillness of the empty cabin. And that evening, long after the aircraft prepared for its next departure, the quiet understanding remained. Respect is not reserved for those who look the part, and the highest altitude a person can reach is not measured in feet above ground, but in the grace with which they treat those around them.